We've been working to change the personality of this clean 1957 Ford Thunderbird.
If you're used to driving a modern car and then you get behind the wheel of something from the 50s, it's a big difference. They don't handle the same, they leak, they don't start right away, they don't steer the same, they don't stop as well. But what do you do if you really like that 50s car, but you want today's driving experience? Well, that's what we do, and we're currently working on a 1957 Ford Thunderbird for a customer who wants that classic look with today's performance. So it came to our shop for this modernization process. And the two main factors of doing this car are going to be the chassis and the engine. The purpose of the new engine is obviously to provide more power and that drivability we're talking about.
The biggest benefit of the Coyote with the 6-speed auto is that Ford gives you basically everything you need to make the engine itself run. It comes out of the box, you bolt it in the car, and it runs pretty much the way it should. If we'd gone some other route with an aftermarket injection system on the original engine, then there's a lot more time in finessing that. And again, to reach your goals, keeping it seamless was the best way to get there. So power wasn't necessarily her goal. Well, just the standard Coyote is around 450, 460 horsepower, something like that. It's just that this fell nicely into the other boxes she wanted to check. And it never hurts to be a little faster than you expect it to be anyway.
The goal of the chassis is to make this car drive basically like a new Mustang. It's got to handle the corners flat, it's got to be comfortable, it's got to stop really well, have precise steering.
So this chassis is pretty typical of a lot of bolt-in aftermarket chassis. It uses a triangulated 4-link in the back, which is nice because that controls your pinion climb when you're on the gas hard. Because if your pinion climbs up in a leaf spring system, the springs wrap up and then the tires might break traction. So 4-links don't do that. And then with the triangulated 4-link, that also keeps the axle centered in the car while you go over bumps and stuff. The front is Mustang 2 based, which means a lot of things these days, which overall it means that it fits Mustang 2 geometry, but there's not any actual Mustang 2 parts on it besides ball joints and tie rod ends.
Tubular upper and lower control arms, a new spindle, but it also relies on a coilover shock, which allows us to fine-tune the spring rates and the ride height, and also adjust the damping of those shock absorbers so we can dial in a nice smooth ride. It also has a rack and pinion steering unit, which is far more precise than the old hydraulic ram assist steering that the Thunderbird had when it was new.
So the chassis is supposed to be for a first generation Thunderbird. But first generation Thunderbirds, they made changes every year between 5, 6, and 7. So the manufacturer doesn't make one for a 57 necessarily. They just make one for all of them.
Some of the body mounts were in a slightly different position on the car than they were on the chassis. And again, that harkens back to the chassis builder telling us that these things changed throughout 1957, and we knew we would have to do a little work there.
Because the rear suspension geometry takes up a little more physical space than the original leaf springs, we had to ditch the spare tire mount and raise the trunk floor up a little bit over the rear cross member where the coilovers and the upper control arms attached to.
But overall, it fit pretty well.
The Ford Coyote V8 features a free-breathing dual overhead cam design, which makes great power, but it can be challenging to install it because of the large overhead width of the cylinder heads.
You got to make sure it's going to fit in the hole, right? And the Coyote V8 that we chose is a very wide engine because it's got dual overhead cams on each cylinder head, which make that width a lot bigger than the Y block that we took out.
The brake booster ends up in the driver's side cylinder head. So re-engineering the whole brake pedal system is one of the first things we did on this car. So basically I reinforced the firewall, drilled a new hole where the brake booster goes, and then I designed a belt crank system under the dash. So the pedal's where it belongs, so it still feels natural to drive, but the brake booster's out of the way under the hood. So we had plenty of room for the engine.
The Ford 6R80 transmission needs a bigger home than the 57 had to offer.
The transmission is very big, so again, we had to cut the floor and accommodate that transmission and make a transmission tunnel.
We only changed what we needed to, which was the transmission tunnel, because the 6R80 is obviously a much larger transmission than the original automatic was. And because of that, Jay in our interior shop made a custom carpet to fit over the tunnel he fabricated. So it's 6-speed automatic, overdrive, lockup. We also put the same rear gear and pretty close to the same tire size as a stock Mustang, so the whole experience should feel as much like basically a new Mustang as possible, while still being easy to drive, user-friendly. If you want to be aggressive with it, we put a low car shifter in with the sport shift mode, so you can still manually shift it if you'd like to, or just lock it and drive and cruise. As with any fuel-injected engine, you got to have the right fuel system, which was another sort of challenge in this car. There's not an aftermarket fuel tank that works well, so what we ultimately used is a street rod version of a early Mustang fuel tank, because it bolts into a perimeter in the floor, because it's designed to be the trunk floor of a Mustang. But the good thing about the street rod version is it doesn't have a filler neck on it, so you can kind of do what you want in that area. And then, of course, being a Mustang, there's a lot more parts available, so we were able to use a Holley drop-in fuel pump module that's designed for a Mustang with the right pressure and flow for a Coyote engine. Obviously, with a late model engine, we want to monitor that pretty well, so we used a Dakota digital VHX gauge set that drops into the factory cluster, so it looks just like it should and doesn't require a bunch of modifications. And then we used a Vintage Air Gen 2 mini AC system, because there's not a lot of room under the dash in this. And the owner didn't want to cut the dash up, so we used under dash vent pods for the AC vents, and just a few modifications to the firewall to fit the AC on, because we're already cutting it up for the tunnel, so we should make it all look nice at the same time from the engine bay.
We finished this bird in our next installment, and the conversion did not let us down. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss it.